best-selling author who sold more than 23 million books worldwide and has the reputation of shaping the thinking of some of the sharpest people on the planet. Professor Harari, welcome.
Hello, thank you for inviting me here.
The brief history of tomorrow and the 21 lessons for the 21st century, which I've carried here to our studios. I'd like to use this interaction as an opportunity to go back to some of the lessons you drew in your books and see how coronavirus could change contemporary thinking about some of the biggest issues of our time. I want to start with a historical context. According to you, what does the coronavirus and humanity's response that we've seen so far tell us about past pandemics and how we are reacting to this pandemic in the context of past pandemics going back several centuries?
Well, we are in a better situation than in almost any previous pandemic in history. First of all, luckily, this pandemic is relatively mild compared to, say, the Black Death. The level of mortality is much, much lower. But most importantly, we now have all the scientific knowledge and the technological tools to stop this pandemic. When the Black Death spread in the Middle Ages, nobody understood what was happening, what was killing people, how it could be stopped. People thought it was punishment from God or something beyond their power to change. Today, in contrast, we understand perfectly what is happening. It took just 2 weeks to identify the virus responsible for the disease, to sequence its entire genome, and to develop reliable tests. So we are no longer blind and powerless. We have the power to manage this crisis. The big question is whether we have the wisdom to use our power correctly. So far, our response has not been ideal. What is lacking above everything else is a united global plan of action of how to deal both with the epidemic itself and with the economic consequences. But it's not too late to unite the world in this struggle against the epidemic.
One of the big changes we've seen between this pandemic and the recent Ebola or the H1N1 flu is that there is no country or leader who's leading humanity in this battle against the virus. There's no leader to inspire, organize, finance a coordinated global response. To what extent do you believe, Professor, that this is impacting the global battle against this virus?
It's a huge, huge problem. Our biggest advantage over the virus is that we can cooperate in ways the virus can't. A virus in China cannot give advice to a virus in the United States, how to infect people. If doctors are curing people in Italy, the Italian viruses cannot ask for help from the Spanish viruses. Humans can do that. China can give advice to the United States. One country can send medical equipment to another country. But if we don't make use of this human ability, then our ability to deal with the crisis is much diminished. And unfortunately, we are now paying the price for the rising international tensions of the last few years. When Ebola struck in 2014, the US led the global effort, which succeeded in stopping Ebola quite quickly. In the previous big economic crisis of 2008, similarly, we had the US leading all the major economies to have a common plan. Now the US has basically resigned its job as global leader. The current administration said very clearly to the world, we no longer care about humanity, we just care about America, America first. And now America is first in sick people and first in dead people. And we have no alternative global leader so far that can unite humankind. And this is critical. To develop a vaccine, we need countries to pool their information together, and we need the ability to trust the information we receive from other countries. To deal with the economic crisis, it's even more important to have cooperation. The US can have a rescue package of $2 trillion, but many countries around the world, from Brazil to India, they don't have these kinds of resources. So unless we have a global economic plan, we might face a global depression. Entire countries could collapse, and this could, of course, destabilize the rest of the world.
The American president has a me first motto. The Chinese president is trying to step in to fill that void. What do you make, sir, of China's attempts to try and lead the world in this crisis, and how is that likely to play out over the next several years?
I am happy to see that China is doing various actions to support other countries in this crisis. There is a lot also to criticize, especially about the initial Chinese handling of the epidemic. If China was an open democratic society in which information could flow freely and people could alert the public to dangerous situation without being punished by the government, maybe we could have prevented this entire pandemic when it just started. And certainly even today, countries have various reasons to doubt some of the Chinese moves. But generally speaking, I am happy to see that China is sharing information, that China is sending equipment to other countries and is doing various actions to help the world. And I think that the ideal result is not to switch one powerful country for another. Instead of a US leader, now we have a Chinese leader. No, the ideal situation is if countries realize they can't rely on just one country, and that we will have a more collective human leadership in which many countries play a part. But for that to happen, we need to encourage global solidarity. I think the most dangerous thing that is now happening in the world is not the virus. We can deal with the virus. The really big problem is the internal demons within humanity itself. We now see a rise of hatred in different places, hatred towards minorities, towards other countries. Different countries blame each other for the epidemic. The US is blaming China, China is blaming the US. In India, I've heard some people blame it on the Muslims, as if it's a Muslim conspiracy to spread the coronavirus. In the Muslim world, they blame Israel and the Jews. In Israel, they blame the Muslim, and so forth. If we allow this kind of hatred to spread, it will prevent us from dealing with the current crisis, and it will poison international relations for years to come. I hope we'll reverse this. Instead of hatred, this crisis will encourage us to develop global solidarity. And if this happens, it's not just that we'll be able to deal with this crisis much more easily, but we will be able to deal with future crises like climate change also much more easily.
You know, we want to tell every single person who's watching on television, on Facebook, on our social media, on Instagram, you can send us questions. This is our first Zoom webinar. Professor Harari is live. Send me your questions, and I will start picking some of those questions that are coming to us in Zoom, and I will start asking them to Professor Harari in just a moment from now. Professor, this virus has seen several short-term emergency measures being implemented, which were completely inconceivable just a few weeks ago. Which of these short-term emergency measures do you believe are likely to become a permanent feature of our lives going forward?
The most likely and dangerous measure is surveillance. We're now seeing mass surveillance systems established even in democratic countries, which previously rejected them. And we also see a change in the nature of surveillance. Previously, surveillance was mainly above the skin. Now it's going under the skin. Governments want to know not just where we go or who we meet. Above all, they want to know what is happening under our skin. What's our body temperature? What's our blood pressure? What is our medical condition? This is, of course, necessary to deal with the epidemic. But if this remains in the long run, there is a danger of establishing new, unprecedented totalitarian regimes. Because if you constantly gather biometric information on people, what's happening inside their body, that can create a much more dangerous dictatorship than anything we've seen before in history. Previously, governments could know, for example, that you are now watching this TV show or this clip on YouTube, but they didn't know what you're actually feeling and thinking. So, okay, you now hear me, they know that, But do you agree with me? Are you afraid? Are you angry? Are you bored? They didn't know. However, just imagine that we have this kind of biometric surveillance, like everybody is wearing bracelets, which constantly measure your heartbeat, your blood pressure, your body temperature. That can tell whoever is monitoring you, not just if you have coronavirus, it can also tell them how you feel, because feelings are also biological phenomena. They can know if you are now scared of what I'm saying, if you dismiss it as nonsense, if you are laughing, if you are crying. So just imagine a place like North Korea in 10 years when everybody has to wear these biometric bracelets and you have to watch an important speech by the big leader, maybe on television. And as you listen to the big leader, they are monitoring your body. You can smile, force yourself to smile, and you can clap your hands. But if you're angry about the big leader, they'll know it. It's the kind of totalitarian regime that even George Orwell in 1984 couldn't imagine. But it could happen in a few years if we are not careful.
But at this moment, if you ask people to choose between concerns about their privacy and concerns about public health, most people who are watching you would pick health. How do you ensure that the totalitarian surveillance, the ubiquitous sensors, the powerful algorithms, the under-the-skin surveillance that you're talking about come in only as a temporary measure and don't become a part of the new normal?
The problem with emergency measures, they tend to stay forever because there is always a new emergency. The government could say, well, this is just for a few months to deal with coronavirus. But even when coronavirus is down to zero, they will say, wait, but there is a second wave coming, so we have to be prepared. And maybe there is a new Ebola epidemic or a new flu, and we will keep it. So the danger is there. And in order to prevent it, people should realize they shouldn't have to choose between privacy and health. They should have both. When I go today to my family doctor, I don't have to choose between health and privacy. In order to get good medical care, I give the doctor a lot of private information about my medical condition, my habits, even my sex life. If there is some sexually transmitted disease, the doctor might start asking me questions about my sex life, things that I don't even want my husband or wife to know. And I trust my doctor to keep this information private and just use it to take care of me without telling it to my boss or to my spouse or to the government. So I can have both health and privacy. And it should be the same with this system. One guideline is, yes, we need a new system of monitoring people with disease to stop epidemic, but it should be a separate healthcare authority, completely separate from the police, from the army, from the secret police. It's not their business. This is not a war. I know many politicians say this is a war. It is not a war. It is a healthcare crisis. We don't have soldiers with rifles storming enemy positions. We have nurses in hospitals changing bed sheets. You don't need expert killers to manage this. You need expert caregivers. So we need a separate authority to be in charge of this surveillance. And secondly, surveillance must always go both ways. It's not just the government monitoring the people. At the same time, the people should monitor the government. This is a democracy. In a dictatorship, it only goes both ways. The government watches you all the time. You don't know what the government is doing. In a democracy, it should go both ways. For instance, right now, governments all over the world are handing out money like water. Like the US is now having a rescue package of $2 trillion. Now, as a citizen, I want to know who is making the decisions and where the money goes. Do they use it to save big corporations whose owners are friends with the politicians? Or do they use the money to save the small businesses of ordinary people? I want, okay, you monitor my health, that's important. At the same time, I monitor what you do with the money. If you have this two-way system of surveillance, then this is democratic.
Since money and revenue at this time is so deeply stretched, what do you believe, Professor Harari, would be the best way of spending limited government funding? It's as big a question in India as it is in Israel and elsewhere. All companies cutting across sectors need help. The big companies need help. They employ huge numbers. Small companies need help. They employ lesser numbers. And poor people need help the most.
Yeah.
Where should limited public financing be spent, in your view?
Well, I'm not an economist and I'm not a medical expert, so I don't want to give advice about something I don't understand deeply. The two important things are, first of all, that many countries simply just don't have enough money. And this is why we need a kind of global safety net. We need in this time, in this crisis, that the richer countries will help the poorer countries. Otherwise, they'll just won't be able to deal with this epidemic. So that's a first principle. And the second principle is that ultimately it's about taking care of people, not of corporations or banks or anything like that. So ultimately the way to judge whether things are working or not, whether we spend the money in the right place, is not what is happening to the stock exchange. It's not what is happening to the Dow Jones or to the Shanghai Composite or any other. No, it's what happens to ordinary people. If you see that the stock exchanges are going up, but ordinary people are starving and don't receive good health care and don't have jobs, then you know that you spend the money in the wrong place, even though the stock exchange is going up.
In countries like Israel, Hungary, we've seen governments use emergency decrees to assume powers they would not be able to enjoy under normal circumstances. Do you see forces of big government, bigger government, and nationalism getting emboldened because of this pandemic? And do you think that's going to be a trend that's here to stay?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest dangers. In times of a crisis like this, when people are afraid for their own lives, they are losing their jobs, their livelihood. Many of them dream about some strong, powerful leader that knows everything and will protect us, and they are willing to let go of all the democratic checks and balances and just trust in one big leader. And that's extremely important. That's extremely dangerous. First of all, because once you have such a big leader, they will not leave once the crisis is over. They will always find an excuse to hang on to power. There is always a new emergency coming. And once you give up your freedom, it's very difficult to take it back. Secondly, dictatorships are just not more efficient than democracies in an emergency like this. People imagine that the dictatorships are better because they can make decisions faster. And that's true to some extent. They don't have to consult with anybody, just one man making all the decisions. But the problem is that if this one man took a wrong decision, made a mistake, usually he will never admit it. He will just blame others. I made the right decision, but there are traitors and enemies, and because of this, the crisis is only getting worse. So I need even more power. Give me even more power to deal with these traitors and enemies. In a democracy, in contrast, when a government makes the wrong decision, it is more willing to admit a mistake and try something else because there are different voices, there are more interests involved in making the decision, and therefore in the long run, we see that even in emergencies, democracies often work better than dictatorships. And you see the world today. So yes, China, which is an authoritarian regime, dealt with the situation relatively effectively, but so did South Korea and Taiwan and New Zealand, which are democracies. And according to at least to some measures, these countries actually dealt with the crisis better than China without becoming dictatorships. So we shouldn't, we have all these strong men just using the emergency, the epidemic is an excuse to gain power, and we shouldn't believe them. We shouldn't fall into this trap.
Every single platform where people are watching you live, we're being inundated with questions, Professor Harari. So I'll start taking some of those questions. People deeply keen on knowing from you what you think about various issues. I'll take the first one. This comes from Swapan Seth, who asks, in one of your recent articles, you write, and he quotes, to achieve a level of compliance and cooperation, you need trust. People need to trust science, to trust public authorities, and to trust the media. You then go on to say that the coronavirus epidemic is a major test of citizenship. He asks, how can governments build trust with citizens? Many governments haven't. How can people improve their sense of citizenship?
So two things. First of all, tell the truth. If for years you are lying to citizens, and citizens are not stupid, they realize that the politicians are not telling them the truth, then in a crisis like this, they will also disbelieve the government. But it's not too late. Even if politicians have been spreading disinformation for years, in a time of crisis, people can change their views very quickly. And if you are honest, if you tell citizens, look, I know I've previously spread disinformation and I apologize for this, but now this is the truth. If people sense that this is done honestly, I think they can change very quickly. The second thing is the reliance on scientific authority. Again, in the recent years, we saw various politicians attacking science, saying that science is unreliable, that scientists are just an elite disconnected from the people, so people shouldn't listen to them, and casting doubt on scientific theories like the theory of evolution or like climate change. In this emergency, one of the good things we see is that suddenly everybody, almost everybody, are turning to science. In Israel, they closed down the synagogues. In Iran, they closed down the mosques. The churches all over the world are telling people, don't come to church, don't come to the temple. Why? Because the scientists said so. We see that even religious zealots in this time of crisis, they turn to science. And I hope people will remember this, and that as a result of this crisis, we will see better scientific education and more trust in scientific authority, not just about epidemics, but also about other things like climate change.
Anju Yadav asks Professor Harari, how will this pandemic affect the global balance of power? Will it restore forces of international cooperation, or will it strengthen forces of nationalism?
Well, that's our choice. I can't predict the future because the future depends on the decisions we now make. If each country chooses to deal with this epidemic on its own, blaming the others for the epidemic, trying to get all the medical equipment, competing with the other countries, not sharing information reliably, then it will make it more difficult to stop the epidemic, and it will poison international relations for many years. If, on the other hand, countries choose to cooperate, to distribute medical equipment in a fair way between the rich and poor countries, to share information, to even send medical help from one country to the other, it will make it easier to deal with the crisis, and it will create a much better international system for the future. So it's not inevitable, it's a matter of what we choose, and I hope we choose global solidarity and not nationalistic competition.
To build to that, Robin Niblett, who's the director and the chief executive of the Chatham House, has written to say the coronavirus pandemic could be the last straw that breaks the back of economic globalization. Do you believe that the economic world order as it existed over the last several decades could collapse once this virus is brought under control?
No, I think it's unlikely. It's gone too far. We might see a certain going back, at least some industries going back to different countries and so forth. But generally, the world has gone too far with economic integration. If now every country tries to just produce everything in its own territory, it will just lead to economic collapse all over the world. Many countries are now completely dependent on these exports, and you just can't produce everything in your own country, even if you're a big country. And if you think about even this current crisis, if every country just tries to produce its own medical equipment and vaccines, it won't work. Everybody hopes that somebody will quickly find a vaccine somewhere, and then they hope that they will get the vaccine from the other country. If they find a vaccine in France, then China, the United States, India, they all hope the French will give them the vaccine. So certainly in the area of medicine, there is no going back. There shouldn't be any going back. And it's the same with all other areas. So I think we will see some restructuring of the global system, but I don't think we'll see a complete collapse of the system.
That's as far as economics is concerned. But in polities, we're already seeing a major inward turn, a search for autonomy and control over one's own fate. Are we headed to a world that's poorer, meaner, and smaller?
Again, that depends on our decisions. It's not inevitable. If we choose nationalistic isolationism, yes, we will be poorer and more miserable and even less healthy. Because to deal with epidemic, you can't deal with an epidemic just by closing your borders and stopping all flights. In the Middle Ages, there were no airplanes, there were no big passenger ships, and still epidemics like the Black Death spread within 10 years, all the way from China to India and the Middle East and Europe. The real antidote to epidemics is not isolation, it's cooperation. When you get information in time between different countries, this is how you stop epidemics in the most easy way. If you cut communication between countries, it's going to be much more difficult to stop future epidemics.
Stephen Walt, who teaches international relations at Harvard University, wrote to say that COVID-19 will accelerate the shift in power and influence from the West to the East. Do you see that happen, Professor?
That could certainly happen, because when you just look at what's happening in the world, people are very impressed by the way that countries in East Asia, not just China, also South Korea, also Japan, have been dealing with the crisis. Whereas Western Europe and especially the United States present a very, very gloomy picture. You know, in the last few years, the world have lost trust in American leadership. Now the world is losing trust in American competence. You see how the US is dealing with the epidemic in its own country, and you say, hey, maybe it's a good thing they no longer lead the world. Because if this is how they deal with their own problems at home, we don't want them to manage anything on the international level. You know, you can fear a country, even hate a country, and still respect its competence. What's happening now to the US is much worse than countries losing their belief in American benevolence. They are losing the belief in American competence.
I want to just for a few minutes play pop publisher and go back to your book and ask you, Professor Harari, if your publisher were to ask you about the various themes you touch upon in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and you were asked to rewrite those chapters, what would you change? And I'll start with immigration. Countries have already been trying to close borders, but what this virus has shown is that the real border is not between nations, it's between humankind and the sphere of the virus. How do you see the problem and the issue of immigration shaping up? If you would write this book again, what would your chapter on immigration seem like, sir?
I think in the end, immigration is up to the decisions of people in each country. I don't believe in a kind of universal right of immigration, that anybody have the right to immigrate anywhere they want. And I don't believe in a universal duty of countries to accept as many immigrants as want to come in. So different countries have different policies. I think in general that for many countries, immigration is a very positive force. We see that many of the best countries in the world, most successful countries, they are immigrant countries. Like the USA, like Australia, like Canada, they were built on waves of immigration. And I think if immigration is done rightly, it's an enormous benefit for the country. But I guess that at least in the next few years, because of the crisis, in many places, there will be more hostile reactions to immigration.
You know, in past pandemics, and I want to refer now to your chapter on religion, God now serves the nation. We saw the church, for example, during past epidemics say, you know, the solution is come together in church, pray, and that led to more and more spreading of the infection. That hasn't happened. How do you see people review and revisit their equations with religion and with God?
I think, you know, there will be some revision. You know, in Israel, for example, before we had an election 2 months ago when the crisis just started, and one of the religious parties They made a promise: if you vote for us in the election, you will not get sick from corona, from COVID-19. And the funny thing is, the leader of that party, who is the health minister of Israel, he got sick. So everybody is now joking that he probably didn't vote for his own party because, God doesn't break his promises. And so many people are starting to have different views of these religious leaders. But the thing about religious leaders, they are not very good in stopping epidemics. It's not their expertise. The real expertise of religious leaders, is making excuses. They are very good. This is what they do all their lives. They promise something, it doesn't happen. They have the best excuses why it didn't happen. So it will be the same with this crisis. They can't really protect people from the disease, but they are now working on inventing all kinds of stories and excuses why their promises did not come true and why this disease is spreading. And I think some people will be convinced by these excuses and will go on believing in these religious leaders. But I hope that at least some people will realize that if you have to choose between a scientist that can actually cure you and a religious leader who is only good at making excuses, it's better to go with the scientist.
You write about post-truth. There's a lot of fake news, which was an epidemic. It's now called the infodemic. Do you believe that trend towards fake news and WhatsApp University, which is a huge scourge in India as it is elsewhere, will strengthen, or will people become more conscious of the news that they consume and start believing more trustworthy sources? Or do you think the epidemic that we've seen will just aggravate?
Again, it's a choice. It's not an inevitable force of history. People can have a lot of choice here. I hope that they will realize the immense danger of relying on unreliable sources in a time like this. And I can give you a simple guideline. If somebody comes to you with some conspiracy theory about COVID-19, how it started, how it spreads, just ask this person a simple question. Please explain to me what a virus is and how does a virus causes disease. If that person has no clue, cannot give you a good explanation, don't believe anything else this person is telling you about the coronavirus epidemic. And I think we see here the importance of giving people scientific education. I'm not talking about a PhD in biology. I'm talking about basic science taught in schools. We need to teach people when they are young things like, what is a virus? How does viruses mutate? This whole epidemic, you can't understand it if you don't believe in the theory of evolution. Because the way that new viruses emerge and change and epidemics start, this is just evolution. If you don't believe in the theory of evolution, you can't understand the epidemic. And this is why it's important to teach the theory of evolution in school. So I hope that
Sachin Shukla is asking you, Professor Harari, and I want to tell our viewers we have a few more minutes left in this interaction. If you want to send me your questions, please do. We're live across YouTube, television, Facebook, Instagram, Zoom. This is our first webinar on Zoom, and we're taking some questions, and Professor Harari is very magnanimously answering those. Sachin Shukla asks you, sir, how do you see people's gratefulness or ability to appreciate each other change after the COVID crisis is over? This comes as we're heading towards more and more embracing of technological devices, and yet how does the human-to-human interaction change now that we all realize how vulnerable we are, regardless of whether we are rich or poor?
Humans are social animals. We like direct contact one with the other. We have to postpone it for the duration of the crisis, because this is how the viruses is using our best instincts against us. If somebody is sick, we want to come and help them, even hug them, take care of them, and this is how the virus spreads. So for the duration of the epidemic, we need to act from the head and not from the heart, but it will not change human nature. When the epidemic is over, these very basic instincts in human nature, they will still be there, so don't worry about it. To give a historical example, you know, when the AIDS epidemic spread in the 1980s, it was much worse than what is happening now. If you got AIDS in the 1980s, you died. It's not like 1 or 2% mortality. It's 100 or 99% mortality. And some people were completely abandoned by the state, like the gay community was completely abandoned. Politicians said, good, it's good that they'll die. And what you saw is that actually people came together. LGBT activists established voluntary organizations to help sick people, to spread reliable information, to struggle for political action, for political intervention. And after the epidemic, actually the LGBT community was much stronger than it was before the epidemic. So this is a good case of how, contrary to the fears of humans, that this will drive humans more distant, apart from each other, actually a time of crisis like this can bring us closer together.
Vidya asks you, sir, what are the lessons humankind should learn from this pandemic to ensure that we don't end up in a similar situation again? And do you believe, on account of climate change, the possibility of the frequency of pandemics increasing is high? What should we as a collective do, as the Homo sapiens species do, to try and stop that from happening?
And the basic antidote to epidemics is cooperation, is sharing information, sharing scientific information, working together to develop medicines, vaccines, alerting countries if something is starting in your own country. This is the basic lesson. If we learn it, we'll be able not just to deal quickly and more effectively with future epidemics, but also with other crises like climate change. As I said before, I think the biggest danger today is not the virus, it's the internal demons of humanity. It's hatred, blaming other people for everything. It's greed, corporations trying to make money out of the misery of other people. And it's ignorance, people believing conspiracy theories and not science. But if we, instead of developing hatred, if we develop compassion to other people, if we develop solidarity, if instead of greed, people are motivated by benevolence in this time of crisis, and if instead of ignorance, people develop an appreciation of the truth and believe science and not conspiracy theories, then we will come out of this crisis much, much stronger than before, and we'll be able to deal more easily with any future danger.
One of the most fascinating chapters in your book, Professor, is the chapter on work, where you say, when you grow up, you may not have a job. We were already heading towards a gig economy. Now, with so much fear about sanitation, about spreading disease, we're already likely to see companies move towards greater automation, more artificial intelligence, deeper machine learning. How does that impact my child, who's 4 years old right now? When he grows up, what's the kind of job or work environment he should be prepared for?
The simple answer, the truthful answer, is that nobody has any idea. For the first time in history, we just don't know how the job market would look like in 2040, in 20 years. What's happening now is really accelerating processes that began earlier. The gig economy that you mentioned, automation, working from home, online, all these things are accelerating. They are opening new opportunities. For example, my university just switched to giving courses online, all the courses. So this may have an opportunity for somebody in India. Maybe my university in Israel could hire you, because if the course is online, the professor can be in Delhi, doesn't have to be in Jerusalem. On the other hand, there are also huge dangers of entire industries collapsing, like tourism, of entire industries shifting. Maybe textile shifts from India, from Bangladesh, from South Asia, back to Europe, because if you just automate the whole thing, robots don't take more money in Germany than in India. They don't take any money. They are just robots. So if industries are automated, we could see a lot of industries going back from developing countries to Europe, to North America. And also there are big questions about job security and the social benefits of workers. If we are not careful, this crisis could lead to the collapse of organized labor, of labor unions, You know, people no longer meet together in the factory. Everybody is just working from home. And this is a political decision. It's not inevitable. We have to be very mindful of the potential consequences of what's happening now for the future. So when governments have these new economic plans, they should constantly be reminded of the importance, not just of saving big companies, but of protecting the rights of workers, of protecting organized labor, of protecting small businesses.
Paresh Rawal, who's sending us questions on Zoom, is asking you, in the light of this pandemic,
I have just 2 more minutes. So.
We're going to be done in 2 minutes, Professor. He asks you, in the light of this pandemic, how do you see the journey of Homo sapiens in becoming Homo Deus, the future man?
Well, I don't think it will stop it. It could only just accelerate it. You know, the basic reaction of humans to this epidemic is not resignation. You know, when the Black Death came, people reacted mainly with resignation. Well, this is a punishment from God, or this is some natural disaster. We can't do anything about it. Our reaction is completely different. It's a mixture of anger and hope. On the one hand, we feel that we now have the power to control these epidemics. So if an epidemic spreads, it's not an inevitable tragedy, it's a human failure. Somebody made a mistake. Politicians did not act correctly. So we are angry. And at the same time, we are very hopeful. We assume that we can invest more money in science, in technology, in different systems to develop vaccines and develop better surveillance systems and deal with epidemics more easily. And everybody is asking when the vaccine will be ready, not if. We assume we can have a vaccine. So I think that after the epidemic, we'll see even more investment in areas.
Last question, Professor.
Yes?
What are you making of what's happening in India in response to this virus in a global context? And I know you say that every country and every civilization thinks they're really important, but in the end, they're not. What are you making of the response that we've seen in India to this virus in a more global context and across time?
I'm not an expert on India, so I don't want to speak about something I don't really understand. I think India faces an enormous challenge because it's much poorer than the United States or Germany or Japan. It doesn't have the same kind of resources. Its healthcare system is not in the same situation. It's an enormous challenge. In previous epidemics, India was very hard hit. In the Spanish flu of 1919, India was the hardest hit country. It's estimated that up to 5% of the population of India died in the Spanish flu. So it's a huge challenge. And I can't comment on how the Indian government is now responding because I don't understand enough. But I would urge people to react not with hatred, but with solidarity, both with other countries and especially with different communities within India. I was very worried about, again, some stories I heard that some people are blaming the epidemic on minorities, on the Muslim minority, even saying that it's a deliberate act of terrorism of people spreading this epidemic. This is complete nonsense. This is extremely dangerous. In this time, we don't need more hatred. We need solidarity. We need love between people. And I hope that Indians could connect to the best in their own traditions, communal traditions, religious traditions, and develop in this crisis solidarity and benevolence and overcome the inner demons of hatred and of greed. And if they do that, I think India and the whole world will emerge from this crisis even better than we were before.
The best antidote to the pandemic is greater global cooperation. I'd let that be the thought Professor Harari leaves us with. Every single sentence over this past 1 hour has dripped of brilliance. For taking out the time, the energy, and the effort of joining us here on India Today, thank you very much, Yuval Noah Harari. We could not have thought of a better way of doing our first e-conclave, inviting questions and inviting one of the sharpest thinkers in the world, to share his thoughts on a situation that is evolving with every single day. Thank you, Dr. Harari, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.